let's talk about mobility. In order to make a city that's fun to move through, you have to understand how the player is going to be moving. Sounds obvious, but it's something that a lot of teams don't understand, including this team. Not in this game, but in the previous games. Saints Row 3 cloned GTA's movement, and they got it feeling pretty good. They got it so that driving a car felt pretty good. But they didn't build their map to be interesting from a car. They didn't build their map so that it would be fun to explore the city in a car. And that's why it felt so flat and uninteresting to try and explore that city. Saints Row 4 had the same problem. They cloned Crackdown. And Crackdown understood that if you're going to be moving at superhuman speeds, you've got to double down on that fact. You've got to make it so that your buildings are fun at a superhuman speed. So Crackdown removed almost all of the human elements from their games. You didn't really have anything like, for example, this. This kind of overhang doesn't really exist in Crackdown because your movement wouldn't work very well in this kind of human scale space. Saints Row 4 didn't understand that. They left a lot of the human elements in, but of course it was very hard to engage with them because your movement wasn't at that speed. When this game was released, Parkour was very popular. We had things like Sleeping Dogs and Assassin's Creed, and those games are all about moving at the edge of human capability. For those kinds of games, you have to design your cities very densely. You can only jump maybe 2 meters at furthest, and it's a big challenge to have a city that's very big. You have to have your super dense cities. You can see that very clearly in Sleeping Dogs especially. It works very well. It's a great little setup, but it is constraining. You have to do very dense work, and that's not every city should be dense. Not every city can bear that density. So in this case, what they've got is it's not parkour exactly. It's like superhuman action game jumping. But it's not so superhuman that we can't deal with it. It's just a little superhuman. It's just superhuman enough that we can do a whole bunch of really strange, cool stunts, but not so superhuman that we lose our human connection. So we still care about, you know, these kinds of ledges and who's here and why they're here and what's going on. And the guy doing Gangnam Style in the corner there. And we're like, oh, well, is this a door? Can we go in? Can we do something in there? Those are questions we wouldn't ask if we were moving at Crackdown speeds. But because our movement speed is still human scale, just fast, we are still interested in these human endeavors. And that's great, because it means that the city can be interesting as a city. We can build it to contain things that cities normally contain, and it'll feel great. That's a very powerful tool, and it's one that this game uses to its extremes. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this up specifically is because when you're building a city out of pieces, you're going to be building it using specific kinds of modules. All of the buildings in this game are built out of repeating modules, and that's true for basically every game you're ever going to see that features a city. You don't build every city entirely out of bespoke parts. Now, depending on how you define it, some of these modules might be like in-game modules where they just collect 8 or 9 specific modules and then repeat them over and over and over. Others might be stuck in like the middleware. They might be middleware modules. Either way, they're modules. It's just a matter of exactly what sort of... come on, you can do this. There we are. It's just a matter of what sort of setup they've got for defining these modules, right? So just as an example, these buildings I'm climbing with the Tron stripe, all of the floors of these buildings are identical, but they're simply rotated slightly as they go up. Now, I can't tell you whether or not they are rotated slightly as they go up in another program or in this program. It doesn't really matter. The point is that they're using a repeating module. The reason that that's incredibly important to internalize is because these modules have to be built from the ground up to support your style of movement. And that's exactly what these are. As you can see, I scaled up them without too much difficulty using my triple jump. And all of the modules in the game are like that. They're built specifically to be easy to interact with my mobility. And that means that they don't have to make every single possible route I can take specific. They don't have to say, oh, well, I want to make sure the player can reach here from here, or I want to make sure the player has a path from here to here. They can do that when they need to, but for the most part, they can just assume that their buildings are going to be fun to navigate because they're built out of elements that are fun to navigate. If we were to go over here, we can see a different category of building, but you can see that it still has specific kinds of outcroppings and ledges that are inherently fun to navigate. Oop, a little too far there. That's fine. So if we were to go across down here, you can see that we've got a little ledge here, and then we've got some billboards we could stand on. If we come around the side, we've got smaller ledges that still support our weight and more billboards. And if we come on over here, we can probably stand on some of these ledges too. And this happens at every scale. For example, these buildings over here, you can see how they've still got ledges that are at the right scale to let us climb them. And these buildings often have other kinds of crenellations. For example, over there, you can see that we've got some ventilation ducts. And of course, those can be reached, and they can be stood on if you don't mess up and miss them. But those kinds of constant crenellations, constant things that you can stand on and move on and walk on, it's probably unlikely that they intended me to stand here. It's unlikely that they planned this building out and were like, yes, we need to have the player have a ledge they can stand on right there. Instead, what it is the building parts they're using simply have inherently ledges. Which means that as you move from building to building, you'll be able to navigate them pretty naturally, even if it's not specifically planned out. So this is just an important thing to talk about just in general, because you do not want to have to plan out every inch of every city. You don't want to have to try and figure out how the player is going to navigate from point A to point B for a million different points. There are certain places where you're going to want the player to, have a specific route, but for the most part, you're going to want your city to be something you can kind of throw together. And it'll be fun, even when you just kind of throw it together. Because that way, you can actually finish your game at some point. Now, if we were to compare this to a similar game, we would come out with Paradise Killer. Paradise Killer has a similar movement style. It is, of course, one jump shy. Paradise Killer has a double jump. This has a triple jump. But other than that, the movement style is very similar. Paradise Killer is a very different style of game. But if you examine how Paradise Killer is built, you'll find that they have a lot of the same basic ideas. A lot of their modules are built specifically to be navigable as modules, and then they're basically just thrown together so that you can enjoy navigating them without planning out too hard exactly what path you have to take. If you compare that to Sleeping Dogs, in Sleeping Dogs, every single path that you can possibly take has to be carefully planned out, because you just can't jump far enough to have your modules be haphazard.
Always room for more.
And I thought that was something we needed to cover before we started to talk about things like how they put the city together and all that jazz. It's a lot of fun to talk about this kind of thing, and it's pretty rare to find a city at this scale. If you were to take a look at other popular cities, for example, Cyberpunk 2077 has a city that feels like it's at the same scale, but most of the time when you start to climb in Cyberpunk 2077, you'll quickly run into barriers. They're like, this is out of bounds. This part of the city just doesn't exist. You're not intended to be able to get up here. And that's because it was never intended to be explored in that way. But this city is, and you can really tell, and it feels really good. That's it. See you around.